Okay, if we start now to do the LEDs. Now, this particular kit came with sort of a jig. What you seem to have to do is use the standoffs that you'll put on the main PCB, and then you can just get the jig at a bit of a better height. Now it's got a row of 8 drilled holes, and then 2 rows of what look like LEDs from the side profile. Now, what you need to do with these LEDs is obviously we'll populate each of the holes, and you can stand them in there. And actually, for doing this cube, there's a couple of choices really. Quite a few guides online I've seen actually have the LEDs mounted, if I can show you, effectively mounted so they are, let's get one I've already bent, effectively mounted, so if you consider this bent, they're effectively mounted so the LEDs are facing one face of the cube, so effectively facing horizontally out, so they're shining effectively horizontally out, effectively that way towards the face of the cube. Now to me that doesn't seem the best way of doing it, because obviously if you then if you're facing the side of the cube that's got obviously the lens of the LED pointing straight at you, then that's nice, you get a nice spot of light, which is really good. And what I'll do is I've got a battery here just to show you. So just a button cell, so we can just use this to test the LEDs. So obviously if you've got your cube facing out like that, you get a nice bright point of light. But then on some sides of the cube, you're going to get the side of the LED, which is, well, not quite so bright. And then on some of the faces, you're going to get the back side of the LED, which is, I don't think that's bright at all. So if you look on the Banggood site and you look at the actual cubes they've got selling now, the one I got actually came with round 5mm LEDs. Pretty much all the ones I've seen now are actually rectangular ones, so 5x2 probably mil. And the way they are mounted is they're actually mounted effectively with the LEDs pointing up to the top face of the cube. Now that means that obviously if you're looking down on it, you get a nice bright spot of light looking down onto the cube. But then for most of the other sides, you are tending to look effectively part way down the side of it at an angle, and you're never actually going to be looking in essence underneath from behind the LEDs. You're never going to see that back face of the LED, because that back face of the LED will effectively be on the base plate or pointing down towards the base plate. So that's how I'm going to wire them up and actually arrange them, with the actual LEDs all pointing effectively upwards to the top face, and then the sides will be pointing, you'll be seeing sort of down them. And I think this is basically what is intended with the jig that we've got here, because what effectively you're doing here is you're taking the positive lead, the long lead, you're bending it to the side, and then you're soldering all the long positive leads together. So you end up with, and here's what I've just done earlier, but I'll explain why this one's not so great. Effectively you've got all the long leads bent down, and you solder them, so you bend them down, and you solder them against the next positive lead, and the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. And then you have your negative leads pointing upwards. Now, the reason this is not a great one is that when I started doing it, I wasn't keen on bending the LEDs right close to the body. So what I did was I actually put a pair of needle nose pliers, just gripped the LED lead, and I bent round the actual needle nose pliers, just to give a little less strain on where the lead enters the body of the LED. However, if you look at how this jig works, it then means that, I think the idea of this is that you then, once you've done the row, you then can lay the LEDs into this effectively side-on section, but because I've bent them not close, not absolutely underneath the LED body, the actual horizontal positive wire doesn't fit down this slot. And I think that is basically what is intended by that slot. So you put your LEDs like that, and then you get another set. If I just arrange them like that, you get another set, and effectively then, this then gives you the vertical spacing, the holes give you the horizontal spacing, and then you can then solder the negative leads onto the next row below. But they're not going to work because of the way they're it, because it doesn't really fit in here. The other slight issue I found with this particular guide is that is with all the LEDs nicely fitting in, all 8 of them, into the round holes. But if you then come to put it into the side-on view, what you get is it's almost as if the side-on ones are very, very slightly shorter, and you tend to get a bow in the middle, and it's actually really quite difficult to do on this one as well. It's not so obvious, but when you're actually trying to solder these when they're laid flat, what tends to happen is that it tends to bow out of the actual jig and makes it really difficult to actually do the soldering. So I have used it for the vertical spacing a little bit, but actually I've also resorted on, just for the purposes of doing it a little bit more accurately, or just checking my alignment, I've also printed myself off a grid. I don't think that's too bright now. Now this grid, it's not a perfect square, and this is from actually measuring the spacings of the holes, the width across, and there's too many columns here, so don't worry about that. These are 20 millimeters. Sorry, that's upside down possibly for you guys, on the horizontal spacing, but the vertical spacing is actually 22 millimeters. That is upside down. I'll put it that way around for you as well. So actually the cube is going to end up being not quite a cube, it's going to be about 2 mil per layer higher as it goes up. But that does appear to be how it is. So if you actually measure, in essence, from the top of that LED to the top of this LED, that distance there to there is 22 millimeters, whereas the distance from the side of this LED to the side of this one is 20 millimeters. So it does seem to be what is intended. You can make it very slightly smaller by having the one LED at the top, sort of right at the bottom of the guide, and then the one LED on the bottom, right at the top of its guide, but that doesn't save you much. It saves you about 1 millimeter. So I've just gone with actually doing the spacing as a 20 by 22. So what I'll do is I'll just do a set of 8 and show you how I'm doing this. So like I say, what I'm doing is I'm bending the positive lead flat to the body, and then that'll get mounted effectively like that, and then we'll do another one. Now I have to keep looking at this every time I do this to make sure I bend the lead in the same direction, for no other reason than it just seemed like a good idea at the time. Probably how I'm going to mount these when I actually do put them on is you've got the extra set of positive contacts down this side, so I'm actually going to have the extra long positive lead, if I can grab hold of the plastic thing, sticking out that side, because at some point we will need to connect those leads there down to these very outside terminals. So I thought actually having that lead overhanging would actually be an easy way to do that. So if I do a few more of these, The problem I'm finding with doing this is that sometimes you end up actually having it a little bit twisted. So you bend it, but then you end up actually with it sort of being twisted round that way. Now you can sort of tell also because on the negative side, or the negative lead, there's the flat body of the LED itself. That's actually quite difficult as you're doing this bending. And like I say, you want to try and get these bent as close to the body as possible, because that then seems to fit better into the jig. Although, like I say, I personally think there's a bit of a flaw in the actual jig design on this particular one. It's not as helpful as at first sight it appears. Now, it might work better for when you've got the rectangular LEDs that the kits seem to mostly come with now, but maybe I don't know what the reason for them changing from the round to the rectangular. I'll do one more. Not that I think I need it. Okay, like that. So I'm going to do, just to make life a bit easier, there's a bit more of a space at this end. So I tend to have the long lead overhanging that way, and then another lead in. The first one is quite tricky because it tends to, so that's a bit out of scope, so I'll get that back in there. The first one's a bit tricky because the leads are a little bit long. In fact, you've got both two moving leads here, which does make it quite tricky to actually do this. Now you can either, and I don't think it makes a great deal of difference to be honest, and that's usually what happens is the thing moves. Okay. Now you can either lay the lead on top of the previous lead, or you can lay it to the side and then solder it. I don't think it makes a great deal of difference. With it fitting in the jig. So just clean the tip of the iron. I don't think it makes a great deal of difference with it fitting in the jig. Though I have found if you've got solder spikes, you do tend to find it difficult to get the actual wire, the positive wire, through the actual guide there. So that's 3 of them done. I'll stick another one in. I mean, you can just go around and load all of them up if you wanted to. I found it easier just to do one at a time. I think you do have to be careful if it's not to let go of these too early, because actually they do retain quite a bit of heat for a fair bit of time. And the annoying thing is then the two leads come apart and you have to redo them. Now I would advise against loading your tip of your soldering iron with solder like this and then taking it along here, because that doesn't really work very well. What is happening is, as you saw there, when you touch on the iron, you're actually releasing, you get some smoke coming off, and that's actually from the flux. So if you actually load it onto the iron first, then what you're doing is you're just burning off all the flux, and the flux is really there and is intended to clean the surfaces prior to the actual soldering, to actually make a better actual joint and actually enable the solder to stick to the surface properly. And finally, the last one. Yeah, I think I'm still in focus there, or still in shot. And there you have it. One line done. And as I said, it doesn't really fit. What I found is it doesn't really fit properly in here. If you put it in, as you can see there, it's got a bit of a bow. And if you actually try and, now I assume you'd possibly put that underneath there and try and put it in, it's sort of, this first LED fits in perfectly, as you can see here, but then this one is, I mean, to me, and it may not show up quite so well for you on the camera, it's about 1 millimetre out. So there does seem to be a bit of a difference in spacing between these holes and the slots here, which makes this jig not as brilliant as it could be. Now, it's possible that the idea is that you don't slot the LED all the way in, and these slots are more intended to, for example, just resting it sort of partly in there. But even that doesn't really work very well, because, you know, even if they don't go all the way in, it ends up being just too long. So that's one done. I'll do another row in just a moment. Now, to make it easier to attach these to the next row, what you're going to end up having to do is actually solder past another LED. I don't know whether this will show up, but effectively what's going to happen is that I'll use two. Have we got another spare LED I've bent? Possibly not. Try this one. You're going to effectively solder past the edge of the next LED down. So this wire here, so the negative here, actually needs to go down, and it needs to come down and touch on the LED lead of the next row down. Now, because the way they've done this, and we've actually got negative leads coming down, these are actually the shorter ones by, you know, about 1 millimetre or 2, which actually means we've actually got not as much room. If it was the positive lead, it would be a lot further, be a better overlap, and you could put a bit of a kink in these at the end and actually touch them on quite easily. The only slight saving grace is that obviously it's going past, obviously the lead is part way into the middle of the body, and we've actually got to get the lead past the widest, or a wide part of the next LED's body down. Now the only slight advantage here is that obviously we're doing it past the flat side of the LED, which is not quite as bad as the sort of necked collar it's got on it. But what I would suggest you do is very slightly bend these wires out a bit. Not by much, literally just by a fraction, just to give them a little bit of guidance around next LED. And then what I've done is I've taken a pair of needle nose pliers and I've just bent, so I go up maybe 3 millimeters, and I just put a bit of a bend on it to bring it back in. That's probably not going to show. What might I do there? And that hopefully will allow us to bring it past the next LED, and then we can tack it on. Now there's no exact distances here, or even by how much you should bend it. I mean, you don't even have to bend it, pre-bend it with the pliers. You can just bend it as you're trying to solder the next row, or this row onto the next row. But that does become can become quite tricky because you're then trying to hold something while apply solder, while trying not burn your fingers and all that sort of stuff. The thing I'd suggest you do is that when you do each row is you, if you have somehow got them slightly bent or the leads are bent, I mean some of the leads that have come in the pack, just because they've been in transit, you know, they're sort of quite dog-legged bent. So you want to straighten those, and when you've done your row, just make sure everything is sort of lined up and it all looks right. So what I'll do is I'll do the next row and I'll get back with you just to show you how to solder 2 rows together. Back in a moment. Well, that's a second row done. One thing I didn't mention earlier, once you've done a row, what you really want to do is actually test them. Now, you can test each LED, as I showed you before, with just a button cell. Oops. And that will just prove that the LED is okay, because you know, these are bulk things, you don't necessarily know they're going to work. But you can also do it with a, so if you've got a normal meter on with a continuity setting on an LED, sorry, a diode setting, that will also provide you with, I don't know whether you can see that glowing, so I'll try and move it to, not sure if that shows up or not. You can go along each one and just make sure they all light. Now the advantage of doing this is also it just proves whether, I mean you can test all the LEDs in isolation, but this actually proves whether you've maybe made a mess up in bending the LED, and you've got, effectively you've bent the wrong lead and you've got the LED the wrong way around. So which I actually did do on one of the earlier ones, and one of the LEDs part way along didn't work even though I tested them all when they came out of the packet. So what we need to do now is I've bent this one, this set for the next leads. So what you need to do is you try and actually now solder them on, and this is where we can use this sort of other part of the jig arrangement. Now it doesn't really matter whether you go sort of downwards or upwards, so you put your new layer in upwards, but obviously, you know, as you do your next layer, you're going to move these down and then solder on top and move them down. The problem you'll find then is that once you get another row in, sort of hanging off this end, it then tends to, you know, effectively do that, and the LEDs fall off, and it's a real pain. Then you have to just try and put something to weigh them down a bit. So I'm actually going to turn this around this way, just to make it easier. Actually, do it this way. So as you can see, or you might be able to see, that lead hopefully now will go down and touch the negative lead on the one below. Now this, like I say, is a bit tricky because you can't sort of jam them in here, because if you do that, they sort of get a bit of a wave. So what I tend to do is I tend to sort of slot them in at one end and push them down so they're sort of flush with the guide board. Get the height the way you want it. Solder that lead on, and lift that one out, and then do down the other end and push that one in so it's well held, and do that one, and then you can do the ones in the middle that don't necessarily need to be pushed in, but you sort of fix the two ends. There you go. That's just now done that one. So like I say, you can now lift that one out, go down this end. The extra wires we've got here do a little bit get in the way, but it's not too bad. I mean, you can tuck them under actually, if you want to. That works quite well. Also, again, at this stage, you might just have to slightly tweak some of these leads just so they line up a bit better. That's it done both ends, and then you can do effectively do in the middle. Or, you know, as I said, if you're not convinced by the jig, you can just use a piece of gridded paper or graph paper, sort of lay your LEDs on them, and then just adjust it until you've got the sort of distance you want. The widthwise should be pretty accurate because it's done with the drilled holes. It is just this sort of between rows distance that is a bit trickier to do. So you get that, you know, both the lines of LED leads go nicely along my lines of grid. So this worked, I thought, worked quite well for me. But if you get on better with the template, that's fine. Like I say, you can then just go along. If you need to, you can just, you know, if you find that maybe you've got a lead bent and you want, you know, just bring that one out a bit or take it in a bit, and it's very easy to do that. And then you can just obviously solder the wire on. And you may also have to at some point just, you know, tweak the lead so it actually does make contact, so you can actually get the soldering on there. That looks quite nice. Ow, quite hot that. Oops, pinged off. And the other approach you can take to this is you can tin both leads. So tin the lead with the iron, tin the other lead, and then just with the iron you can then reflow it, and that shouldn't require that's fine, because you're not actually sort of transferring solder to the actual joint. You're just effectively reflowing solder that's already there. There's already been the flux that you've already applied to it has already done its job, and actually done the, you know, allowed it to stick properly to the actual leads. That's looking good. Another one. So I think it's only that one out. And again, this one is, because it's quite a short distance. Let's take off. Because the lead is quite short, it only just manages to go past this LED. We look at one down here, for example, just goes past the LED and then just about touches the actual lead. You can either put it to the side to get a better contact, or just touch it on the top, but it is worth giving it a reasonable sort of blob of solder there, well, obviously without going into excess. And then that's now 2 rows down. And again, at this stage, you know, lay it out, make sure that you haven't got any bent wires, or, you know, if some of the leads now need to be sort of straightened up for when you put the next row on, here's your sort of opportunity to do that. So that's 2 rows done. I've actually got one I've done earlier, which is an entire sheet now. and that's not too bad. If I lay it against my grid, I'm pretty much, I think I've actually got it back here. If I put it the right way around, it looks a bit better. Pretty much got that spot on the grid. No, I actually got it on the right grid to start with, I think. No, it was that way. Okay, it is actually pretty much spot on down this side and spot on that side. So it's just a useful guide just to help you, that is. So I'll carry on doing more of these. I might do a few of them just time-lapsed, so you can see me do a few more. But other than that, I'll be back with you when I've done all the rest of them. And we're back. That's all the LED panels done. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So they're all soldered and ready to go. What I suggest you do is just double check them. So if we just get these out of the way a moment, just get one of them. Yes, we've checked every row as we were doing them, but it is worth checking the whole array now it's completely done, just to make sure we haven't somehow got a poor connection somewhere. So if we get the meter back in onto the diode test mode, what we can do is put the positive on that one, and we can test each of the rows or each of the pixels, and then again I just go through basically the whole 8 by 8 by 8 and just check them all, all the way down. So you've got the last row, and always test it from the outside ones here, because these are the ones that are going to be powered, and these ones which will be the ones which will be switched, rather than sort of testing one like that or something like that, because that's only really testing a very close connection. If you test basically powering it there and grounding it there or the other way around, then you're going to effectively test how it's going to be driven on the actual final thing. It's also worth at this stage, and if you've done that as you go through, in just making sure that everything is nice and square. Now, that is one of the reasons why I did my grid in the end. As you can see here, it's not perfect. If we line up this edge, this solder line here, then we've got a slightly bigger gap here, unfortunately. So obviously this row has drifted slightly wider compared to this end, so you get a slight discontinuity in the cube. But what doing this on a grid will help you do in the end is, if you've got it sort of parallelogram, so it's sort of shifted like that, so that row and that row are parallel, but they're now twisted that way, but this says parallel, you can effectively do a bit of twisting it back, and then you get it nice and neat. And in the end, that's going to help you get a neat looking actual cube. So what I'll do is I'll adjust where the camera is going to be pointing, and I'll get the PCB back in, and I'll show you how we're actually going to mount these on it. Back mount. Okay, back on me now. What I have done is I've put the feet on the PCB. They were originally on the soldering guide, but now I put them on the PCB. It's easier to do that now than when you've got the grid installed, because these screws are inside the grid. It'll be quite difficult. One thing I suggest you do is that before you put all these on, like I say, just check they're all square, but also check they are not bent up like that. Also, you might just want to do any adjustments to make sure that all your LEDs, you want to try and make a neat solution, are sort of in line and everything. So what I've done with this particular row is, because I left the pins sticking out for the positives, I've actually now bent these over, because what we're going to end up doing is we're actually going to end up soldering all the positives of all the rows, or all the flat planes across from each of these together. So I thought, well, if I can use these rather than just bare wires and solder them across, I might see if I can give it a go. If it proves to be a bit difficult, because we've got two leads soldered together here, it is quite difficult to bend it. What you want to do probably is to put a pair of needle nose pliers right close to the body of the LED and bend around that, so you're not stressing the LED body. You don't want to break the wire off, or the lead off that. I'll see if that works. If it doesn't, I'll simply take the snips and I'll snip these leads off short, and I'll just solder bare wires on and use that to sort of keep the grid, or keep electricity, or the connection between all the planes, but also it gives the grid a bit more rigidity. So what we want to do is we want to take our panels and we want to slot them into the pins that we've got on the PCB. So each of these in turn, I suggest you start at one end, align it, and then gently pushing them. Don't push them too far, because all these should be, hopefully, about the same length. And then gradually work across. It's going to be a bit of a fiddle, and what you might need to do is actually use a pair of needle nose pliers. So if we just work the first one in, then it literally is a case of try and get the next one, then the next one in, next one in. It gets a little bit more difficult as the further you go across, because the angle gets a bit less. At some point you want to just gently pull one of these in, but I do it low down on the lead rather than pressing on these, because you might bend the leads. And you might actually find that some of these, just for manufacturing, are slightly longer than some of the other ones. So that's now popped out. That feels like they're all basically there. Pull them down very gently so you don't twist the grid into each of the pin holders. They're sprung loaded, so there's a bit of resistance to actually get past it initially. And that's our first panel in. So I'm going to do the rest. I might time lapse it. It's not going to be very exciting. It's going to be a lot of fiddling, and then we'll see how soldering across some of these wires actually works. Like I say, I don't know whether it's actually going to work at the moment. We'll give it a go. If it proves too difficult, like I said, I'm just going to snip them off with the snips and just do that. So once I've got all these in, I'll be back with you shortly. Just a quick update. I did try keeping the bent wires on and bend them around after I got 2 rows in. I thought I'd see how difficult it was to actually bend them and solder them on. It is actually quite tricky, because bending these particular wires, because we've actually soldered 2 wires together, actually bend them in a sharp radius is really difficult, and it seems to put quite a bit of stress obviously on the wires at that point. So when you come to then solder the next one across, so effectively solder the next one across, it just pings the second joint apart because it's now under quite a bit of tension because you bent it. So what I'm going to do instead is I've actually got some single core wire. Now the kit does come with some wire, but it's painfully thin, which is meant to connect the rows or the planes down to the baseboard. I'm not quite sure how you're expected to use this wire because it doesn't actually grip inside the sockets. So I've actually got from something else just some solid core wire, which I'm going to use for this. And this will then, I'll use this to go across the planes because it's actually quite rigid. It'll keep the whole thing a little bit more rigid then. So I'm going to carry on doing this. So I'm going to just snip these off just around where the solder joint is, so it doesn't stick out too far, but obviously not too close. And I'm going to put all the next rows in, and then I'm going to solder across. I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, so I've actually started to do some of the wires across here. So what we're doing is we're connecting a wire for each plane, and so we're joining all the positive connections here, and then we'll get separate wires that go from the positive pin down here to each layer in turn, and that'll energise those layers. So what I've done with this is I've got some thicker wire. The pack itself comes with some quite thin wire, really thin in fact. I mean it's ridiculously thin, it's not going to do anything useful. So I had to have some single core or single stranded wire, quite thick stuff with a sheath on it. So I've been stripping this back, cutting it to about the right length. If you then straighten it as best as you can then sort of lay this on the positive tails of the actual LEDs and then solder them. What you can also do with this as well is you can actually use this to correct the spacing, so you actually make your grid a little bit more square and a bit more rigid. Now it is quite tricky doing this, to actually get this on here, to then solder it and then do the adjustment and also measure it. So actually what I did in the end was I cut up a bit of wire and I actually put little black Sharpie marks at the 20cm spacing, so then I can sort of lay it on here, I can solder one end, solder the other end and just adjust it, and then for the ones in the middle just adjust them so they're basically sort of lined up with the Sharpie marks. And the Sharpie will just basically burn off as soon as you put soldering on it. So I've got a few more of these to do. So far I've done these rows at the top. I've got these last 3 rows at the bottom to do as well. I've also done a bit of strengthening on the top. So I've got one down the middle that just keeps that top surface sort of nice and rigid and doesn't get the move. You're not going to be able to do any ones in the middle down there. But I've also done just a couple of rows on this back side as well. So I've actually put some wires just inside, because obviously this lead is the negative, so you can't obviously tack onto that, so you want to be doing actually just inside here. So I've actually just set it back a little bit. Now you can, if you want to, do more of these, and I might do a few more just so there's a little less movement. Perhaps I might just do perhaps one in the middle. I may not do every single row, it's probably just not worth it. And then you've got the one at the top. And again, like I say, this just strengthens it up a bit and just makes it a little bit more rigid. Now you can use this, like I say, to just correct any alignment problems. So I think I had one row that when I looked down the LEDs, effectively look down this way because these are the sheets, one of the rows was actually sort of squiff off a bit. So I've actually used the wires here to sort of line things up and make it a bit neater. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on doing a few more of these rows on this side, and then we've got the wires that will go down to the actual planes here. And again, like I say, I'm going to use some of the thicker wire I've got. Now I've cut various lengths here, so I've just measured up some lengths. These are basically going to go into the pins, the extra pins on the outside. I'm going to go up to these planes, the positive planes, and just solder them onto there. But I'm going to do all the other supporting wires first, and I'll get back to doing all these. So So I'll just finish off doing that and I'll be back with you shortly. A useful tip if you're trying to align the various layers, the vertical layers here, or vertical sheets. What I did was I used the soldering jig just to produce a little template, just in some fairly thin cardboard. What you can do is you can just punch the holes out, 5mm, slip over the LEDs. That then keeps the sheet spacing about right, and it makes it much easier then to solder the wires on for the layers. And you can do that when you're doing the middle ones as well if you want to, just to keep the spacing. And it not only keeps the distance between the sheets correct, but it also, if you've got sheets that are sort of out of alignment with the other ones, that also helps a bit. So that's just a bit of a tip on that one that I found quite useful. Right, that's all the layers I'm going to do now, all the wires I'm going to do. So I've got wires all on this face for every layer, and on the back face here, just for a bit of rigidity, I've just got them sort of every other layer. So the top one, the second one down, fourth one down, etc. And just one up the middle. And the ones in the middle, yeah, they're not going to get moved, so they should be fine. So the final step now is just to connect the positives of each of these outside pins to each of the layers we've done. Now these pins are labelled H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8, and those are effectively for layers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8 going up the cube. So what we need to do is connect this first pin to this first positive rail. So what I've done is I've cut and shaped some pieces of the wire. I've got a whole load of them here for the various levels. All I've done is I've just stripped it back at the bottom so it pushes into the connector. You might find it's easier to use a pair of needle nose pliers for this. So I can push that in, and I've just bent it over just to produce a slightly neater finish against my positive wire then. So I'm going to solder that one on, and I'll get the next one I've done, which must be this one. This will be from H2 to the second layer. Again, I just push this one in and solder it back. If you want to, you can just to neaten it up, you can put a little bend in appropriately, just so it sort of nicely sits against the LEDs as they go up, and do that all the way across. So I'll do that now. I'll just do the first one, then I'll just time lapse the rest. It's a bit difficult to actually do this without getting away with the camera. You might find that some of the actual layers of LEDs move slightly on this, in which case you might just have to, once you've done it, just reflow that joint and just move the LED to one side. Again, that's the first layer done, and like I say, I'll do the others just in time lapse, so it won't take too long. Okay, that is everything now complete. I've got myself a power bank which I've plugged in, and we're ready to give it a go. So if I just power it on, you should initially see the self-colour changing LEDs at the bottom underneath flash, and then it'll go through a self-test. Now I think you can spot there's actually something wrong here. We're missing this row. Okay, well everything else from looking at the self-test pattern seems to be working. We're going up the sheets, we're missing this one, and going across we're getting all the LEDs, so it's almost right, but it's not quite right there. So just turn it off, or just do a bit of diagnostics on this one. So if we get the meter, we can, now it's the third row down, so if we just put on the positive rail, and we'll just check maybe the LEDs. Oh, we're getting LED lit there and there. So that row is good in that respect, so there must be something else wrong. So maybe it's the lead that's going up to it. So if we put the pin at the bottom and then maybe touch, okay, so it must be something wrong with that wire. And indeed, well, the wire's not broken because we've got continuity up to that point, but we don't have continuity to the positive rail. So obviously this joint is up. In fact, there you go, that's the problem. This joint is not good. So we'll just fix that and we'll try again. That seems a bit better this time. So let's try again. Maybe second time lucky. There go the colour changing LEDs at the bottom again. And that looks right now. And here is the finished cube now. It's all been soldered together, and it's ready to go into the case, which I've got sort of built ready there. So I think it looks quite neat actually. I'm quite pleased with this. I've got all the sheets pretty much lined up. All the LEDs seem to be nicely aligned. Come down, I can show you a bit of a close-up of the joints. Just zoom in a bit. And there you can see the joints between the horizontal planes. If we just turn it around, there are all the joints along the various sheets, the vertical sheets. Right, what's left now is to put it in its case then. And then we'll see how it operates. Back shortly. And there's the final finished cube in its acrylic case. I think that does look really, really neat. So what I'll do next is I'll work out how you actually drive the thing, what the effects are, how you can sort of connect it to the computer, and also the Android app. And I will make another video of that. So I'll be back with you to do that then. Thank you.